for people?
No, just everybody be well, man.
Amen. Amen. Okay, so Amen. Continuing with the theme of Chilul Hashem. So it says here, the Torah's view of Chilul Hashem. The phrase desecration of Hashem's name is mentioned several times in the Torah. First, in Vayikra, verse 19, chapter 19, verse 12, and says, "You shall not swear falsely by my name, thereby desecrating the name of your God. I am Hashem." Later it is written, "You shall not desecrate my holy name. Rather, I should be sanctified amongst the children of Israel." While both verses mention desecration of Hashem's name, the practical meaning of this phrase is different in each context. Regarding the latter verse, Rashi comments that the phrase I should be sanctified teaches that one should sacrifice one's life and thereby sanctify my name. We are commanded to sanctify Hashem's name, as it is written in Vayikra, chapter 22, verse 32. I should be sanctified among the children of Israel means that we must risk our lives for the fulfillment of the mitzvahs of our religion. Sefer Chinuch enumerates the 3 mitzvahs for which one must rather die rather than violate, i.e., that is adultery, and murder. The former verse, Vayikra chapter 19, verse 12, speaks about the desecration of Hashem's name in connection with swearing falsely for illicit monetary gain. Rash Batz in Magen Avot explains that why swearing falsely is deemed Chilul Hashem. And we'll finish with this. There is no greater desecration of Hashem's name than this. He steals his friend's money by using Hashem's honored and awesome name. So our sages said that if a person who is great in the wisdom of the Torah does things that are inappropriate and causes everyone to be appalled, he desecrates Hashem's name. Okay. Continue. There's still a bit more, so we can just explore a bit more, actually.
Right. Guys, it's in the, if you look, it's in the 74th daf on Sanhedrin, the 3 cardinal sins. I didn't remember offhand. I had to look it up, but I needed to look it up for other reasons. So it's the 74th daf. Okay.
That's very impressive, yeah.
So it's not actually, because what happens is when you've done Gemara, what you need to do is, my brother used to do tags, and you can actually source. If you've got a one sheet, for example, the Chumash, you can see where all the mitzvahs are derived from. It's the same thing with the Gemara, is that you just have to learn the index. That's all. All right, it sounds more impressive than it is. It's not impressive.
No, but you have to be smart enough to actually understand what an index is. So, right.
Okay, well, that's
what the normal type of indexing word, trust me.
Fair enough. All right, so guys, what we were learning was pretty simple, is that it was a case where the mother of Rav Shmuel bar Abba of Hagronia was married to her second husband, also Rav Abba, and she wrote over her property to Rav Shmuel bar Abba, her son, after she died. So naturally, what happens is that there was an argument as far as her malog property. Does when the wife died, the husband wanted to inherit it upon her death, and the son, she wanted the son to inherit it upon her death. And obviously went to court. And who did the son get support for? Rav Shmuel bar Abba went before Rav Yirma bar Abba for a ruling, and he said that the son is correct. The husband's reaction was, he went to Rav Shaya, who went before Rav Yehuda, and Rav Yehuda took it to the sourcing from the Moira Shmuel. So where did the Moira Shmuel pick it up from? A woman who sold malog property during the lifetime of her husband and then died. The husband removes the property from the possession of the purchasers. And Well, where's that from? Well, Gavin asked a good question, and the reality is whether it was given over as a gifting or sold over, it's still halachically seen as one person's will that it changes ownership. And then in this case, according to Rav Shmuel, it's the husband's got an extraordinarily strong right to control the property. Now that is different, but let's just look at the law as we know in Bava Basra 111b. As in any case of inheritance, a husband inherits his wife, okay? But that applies to property that was owned by the deceased at the time of his death. That's the literal. That's literally where it's pulled from Bava Basra. So as long as he lives, he has the full right to dispose of his possessions as he pleases, even though this means that his heir-to-be will not inherit them. So accordingly, Rav Yirma bar Abba ruled that the gift of Shmuel bar Abba's mother to her son during her lifetime was valid. Anyway, look, the bottom line of it is they didn't agree, and there are two schools of thought. The one was Rav Shimon ben Lakish, and the other one was Rav Yochanan. Does anybody know who had which opinion from yesterday, guys?
You've got a good memory. Kevin, you got a good memory. Huh?
About this Milok property, about her.
Well, forget about the Milok property to start with. Let's just talk about
The husband's rights.
Before we even talk about, there's two things going on in the Gemara. The first thing is that the wife died. Before she married the second husband, she inherited the property from her late husband. So she gifted it over to her son. So when the wife died, the husband wasn't happy because he said that he was entitled to it. And the son said that he was entitled to it. So they both went to their respective opinions, and each of their respective opinions said they were right. And the bottom line of it is, this comes back to a tonight discussion. So Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, bottom line, said that we're talking of a case of inheritance. And if a father left a property to a son, for example, how does it actually work exactly? So the argument was, who actually acquires the rights to sell the property? Is it the person that has the usufruct, in other words, or is it the person that has the capital amount? So the usufruct you can think of is the produce the farm gives over, and the actual capital amount is what the farm is worth in terms of its title deed. So according to Reish Lakish, if you own the title deed, you've got rights to sell the property. And at the end of the day, according to Rav Yochanan, if you own the produce, you have the rights to sell the property. But what we also learned is it was a limited sale. So the bottom line of it is, if there's another party that owns the produce and the one owns the essence of it, which is the title deed, you need both in order to give consent for a full sale to take place. In other words, it's known as a conditional sale. Okay, so at the end of the day, that's the issue that we're dealing with here. So, in other words, we learned in a Mishnah, if one writes over his properties to his son for him to acquire after his father's death, the son cannot sell the properties completely because they are in possession of the father. And the father cannot sell the properties completely because they are written over to the son. Okay? So what that basically means is that the father has to write and deed, acquire the property from today and after death. In which case the son acquires the essence of the property. What we mean is the title deed immediately. And the father retains the rights to the produce, which is a usufruct until his death. So the expression in the will from today and after death, when used in a title deed, means acquire the essence now that's given over to his son while he's alive. Obviously, when the father dies, the son inherits it anyway. And he is saying to his son, the rights to the produce we can only get after the father dies, basically. So the son can't make a full sale of the land because the father still has rights to the produce. That's a given. But the son can accomplish what we call a conditional or limited sale of the property. I'm going to explain what that means. Now, as far as that other aspect is concerned, that the father cannot sell the properties completely either because they're written over to the son, basically means that because the son already owns the land itself and will eventually own the produce after his father's death, the father himself also can accomplish a sort of limited sale as the property. So what's this argument? Who can perform a sale? Kev, you wanted to know something?
Yeah, so is this going to lead to, if there's a claim against the father and the son is the ultimate heir of this property, can they claim against the son eventually if the father passes on, if it was against him? Is that what it's going to get to?
So what it's going to get to is as follows. We want to know this case with, well, in essence, it's going to say, well, how does this connect to the mother of Rav Shmuel Bar Abba of Agronia? Does the son inherit it because his father who died left it to the mom? Or did when the mother remarry her new husband, because it's Malog property and he gets the usufruct, in other words, he's allowed to use the produce, it's part of the marriage arrangement, does that mean he can block the sale? Or let's put it this way, as Gavin said, block the gifting, the inheritance. That's in essence what we're dealing with here. So we're going to...
Damon?
Yeah?
Basically, he's actually the first purchaser. Because he buys the woman with the property.
Explain what you mean, mate.
Well, when he married her, okay, the Ketubah is the purchase. So he purchased her and the property. So he gets first dibs on if something if the son died, right?
Yeah, so
Okay.
that's a slightly
Well,
different
okay,
issue.
yes.
You've got
Okay.
a point. That's a slightly different issue. That issue is part of the ketubot. You've got what you call your statutory amount. You've got your additional
Okay.
amounts, and that does form part and parcel of the ketubah. That's the argument at play. But he's not
Okay.
a purchaser in the sense that he's got full rights to the property because she, in essence, still owns the title deed. So,
Okay, so basically what you're saying is this is his stepdad, basically.
this is his stepdad. So can she, if she wrote it in a will that it goes to the son, does that will supersede her marital obligations? That's what we're dealing with. So in other words, we don't know yet. But in essence, he is entitled to certain rights, and that's the rights to the usufruct, the produce of the farm.
Yeah.
So can he block the sale or not? That's in essence what we're dealing with. All right, so guys, the reason why I'm going through, I didn't think we'd have to really go through yesterday a little bit, but I'm happy to because it's going to get much more complicated, okay?
Yeah,
So,
no, you know what? I think we just forgot kind of the next section, which is, as soon as you started talking about it, we kind of knew more or less what the answer was, but we had forgotten that second part of that. Sorry, well, I had it.
no, there's no problem. There's the bottom line is you actually can give it over.
I remember all of this from yesterday. I think probably Kevin does as well.
What's that, Gavin?
Just couldn't give it over.
No, never. Not like Damon. Damon's maybe Arthur can.
So listen, guys. If I put it over in a couple of easy steps, it's saying that there is going to be an issue with the father and the son. But the bottom line is, if the father did sell the properties, it's basically saying that the father can't sell the properties completely either because they're written over to the son. So what he's saying, what happens if the father did sell the properties? They are sold until he dies. So what do we mean? It's a conditional sale. Do you know what we mean by that, Gavin, or not? If not, I can expand. Otherwise, you need to explain it.
That when his child dies, it goes back to the son.
So, well, that's pretty much is that the buyer acquires whatever rights the father had retained in the property. In other words, the buyer acquires the rights of the property's produce until the father dies. So what's actually happening is the buyer is technically renting by paying a stipend during the father's lifetime for the produce. But at the point where the father dies, all the produce reverts to the son because it goes back to we inherited it. So it's a conditional sale, meaning it's a sale that doesn't take place. It's a sale while the father's alive, because the only thing that the father controls is the produce, is the usufruct. He doesn't control the essence, so he can't sell the essence. Now the question arises is what happens if it's the other way around? Can the son sell the property if he only has the title deed and not the produce? Okay, so Rav Yirmiyah Bar Abba begins this explanation of exactly how the Mishnah supports this view. That in the last case, when the father dies at least, the buyers acquired the property completely. And so this is, even when the son died during the father's lifetime, so the rights of the produce never actually came into possession of the son. So it's saying, look, the only way that the father can technically, the only way that the buyer can technically have the complete property ceded to him by the father is if the son dies in the father's lifetime. That's the bottom line. So,
Damon, this sounds like the mafia. It sounds funny, but go on the property, take the son out, then the father, and you go, look.
It's a risky thing, yeah.
It is hectically risky, but we did say that there were reasons. So, in other words, if the son ultimately died before the father, it emerges that the son's ownership of this essence really, guys, it never gave him any practical benefit, because the only thing of it is he thought that he'd outlive his father, and then he'd end up getting the produce from the farm. If he isn't getting the produce from the farm, what has he really gotten? See, so the son owned the essence of the land for the purpose of eventually inheriting it and obtaining the rights to the produce when the father died, but the son never actually lived to receive any of those rights. So the ownership of the essence, though, did give him one thing, and that enabled him to sell the property for when his father's benefits would end. But in other words, what we're saying is there was one right that was stronger. The title deed is a stronger right than the right to the produce, because the father couldn't block the sale. But what the son can't do is lose the father's protection in the produce. Say the father wanted nothing to do with the sale, and he said, I'm happy to keep my usufruct, the produce. The person that bought the property cannot affect the father's ability to get the produce during the father's lifetime. So he only in essence gets a completed sale or a non-conditional sale of using the produce as well as the title deed when the father dies. So in essence, what the Gemara is asking is, according to Reish Lakish and according to Rav Yochanan, what is stronger? Is it the title deed or is it the produce? So we say, well, it depends if you're holding by Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish, because what this does do is it mimics the original tonight discussion. Okay. Let me put it to you like this. So let's go to some background information. Rav Yirmiyah Bar Abba is in accordance with Rav Shimon ben Lakish, because no matter whether the son died during the lifetime of the father, in which case the produce never came into possession of the son, or whether the father died during the lifetime of the son, in which case the produce actually did come into the inheritance of the son, buyer has acquired the properties. So what do we mean? Is that if you look at the last case, if the son sold the property during the father's lifetime and the son died during the father's lifetime, Rav Yochanan says the buyer doesn't acquire the property upon the father's death. But Reish Lakish says that the buyer acquires the property on the father's death. So let's just look at the first view. Let's look at Rav Yochanan. It's not a contradiction, because Rav Yochanan would basically say to you, look, same as Reish Lakish, is that for a full sale to take place, there would have to be the cooperation of the son and the father. But in essence, if there isn't cooperation, the produce still goes to the father during his lifetime, and the son has the title deed. But can the father block the right to the sale of the property if he doesn't want to by just owning the produce? So when did the Mishnah teach that if the son sold the properties, the buyer has not acquired anything in those properties until the father dies? Implying that when the father dies, the buyer has acquired some of the properties, when the son did not die during the lifetime of the father, which is obviously usually the case, so that the produce came in possession of the son before he died. So basically, in that case, it's retroactively revealed that the son's acquisition of the essence of the property, which is the title deed, gave him rights to the produce as well. He just couldn't strip his father away from those rights, but he was eventually going to get it in the inheritance. Okay, and since that was the case, it's pretty strong. But if the son died during the lifetime of his father, and that the produce never came in possession of the son, when the father eventually also dies, the buyer didn't have any rights to it. So why didn't he have any rights to it? Because Rav Yochanan holds that there was no sale that took place because the ownership of the rights to the produce of the property is tantamount to ownership of the property's essence. In other words, according to Rav Yochanan, when one person holds the title of an article, in other words, he owns the essence, and a second person possesses, even for a limited period of time, the right of the usufruct, the question arises as to who's considered for that period of time the article's primary owner with regard to any special laws of transfer that pertain to the owner of the property. So, guys, on the one hand, the main function of a property is what? To yield produce. So the owner of the right of that usufruct should be deemed the article's primary owner, according to Rav Yochanan. On the other hand, the right of the usufruct is only temporary while the father's alive, and it doesn't mean you own the title deed. So the title holder of the article's essence possesses something that when the right of usufruct terminates, like the father dies, the article is going to revert completely and permanently to the owner of the title deed, because then he also inherits the produce. So obviously, the title holder, according to Reish Lakish, is the article's primary owner. That's the bottom line. Okay. So if you look at the second view, anyway, according to Rav Yochanan, the son was selling something that wasn't his to sell, because the father had the rights to the produce, which means he is the overall say. But that's according to Rav Yochanan. Rav Shimon ben Lakish says that the buyer acquires the property upon the father's death. Why? Because the title deed is stronger, but you can't rob your father of the usufruct, of in actual fact the essence of the property. So obviously when the father dies, the buyer then has acquired the property, because then the produce goes back to the son, and then the son, it's no longer a conditional sale, it goes directly to the buyer. In terms of whether the buyer pays an additional amount for the produce use, probably, unless it was a conditional sale where he said that I'm not in essence going to pay, I've booked a stake in it, I've put a deposit, but in essence, I'm only going to pay the balance when I'll see that I get to use the produce as well, Gavin. So it doesn't have to be just based on the title deed or just based on the produce. There can be a conditional purchaser too. So obviously, it's a different case. So when the father, so the bottom line is when it doesn't matter whether the son died or didn't die during the lifetime of the father. The produce came into possession of the son, or whether the son died and the produce didn't come into possession of the son. In either case, the buyers acquired the property. We see that Reish Lakish holds that ownership of the rights of produce is not tantamount to ownership of the property's essence at all. So in other words, even the person with the usufruct that's got full rights to the produce can't interfere with the title holder's ownership of the land itself, nor his ability to sell the land. So when the son sold the property, it was selling something, it was his. So the bottom line is, well, how do we hold before we get to this issue of what's going to happen with the Malok property? Is that when you look at both the opinions, when basically the son went to Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba, and the second husband went to Rav Yehuda. But we see that both of them have to hold by Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish and not Rav Yochanan. Why? Because there's only 3 times in Shas when the Talmud follows Reish Lakish, when Reish Lakish argues with Rav Yochanan. This is one of those times. Okay? This is one of those times that the halacha actually accords with Reish Lakish. So now what we're saying is at a later date, both when the second husband as well as the son were arguing in terms of who inherits the property, it's got to go with Reish Lakish, which means at the end of the day, whoever owns the essence of the property, the title deed, gets to use the property. So then you're going to say, guys, it's a slam dunk case. Then obviously the son gets it, because the only thing that the husband's entitled to after the Malok property is actually the produce, which means he can't block the sale. So then why didn't they both say according to that? So we're going to learn next time is how do you learn this case of the son's inheritance from his late father when the mother dies, versus does the husband get the right to block the sale? And in fact, is it part of his ketubah, as Arthur said? Well, no, let me put it that way. Is it part of the fact that her malog property, which she signed over to the husband, in essence, as part of her contractual obligations to the husband? So his ketubah means he promises her certain things. I'm coming to you right now, and she promises him certain things. So does that take precedence over inheritance? In other words, does she cede over that property to a new husband? So we're going to deal with that next time. Kev, what were you going to ask?
I mean, in the normal course of, normal standard legal argument, the person that holds the title deeds is the one in the pound seats, not the person that's entitled to the fruits, the fructus of it. I mean, that's doesn't mean, unless it should specifically say that, let's say that, which is a few minutes ago, that the husband is entitled to fructus. What's the word again? The fructus.
Well, hopefully
the usufruct. But if it says specifically,
I want to tell you a joke. Hopefully, the usufruct will produce produce which has fructose in it if it's a farm.
Produce, yes. But unless it specifically says he has the right to the usufruct and he is a title owner.
So listen, I don't know if it's so clear, because there might be a case in secular law where that person can take over the actual ownership of the property, and that person is allowed to stay in that property rent-free if that was a conditional sale. But I don't know who would agree to such a thing in secular law. I don't know.
Well, that would be a usufruct, or a stay there. Is it? No, as a usufruct, is a usufruct basically someone owns land or owns a farm that has fruit trees, and the person can gather the fruit, and that's their benefit. That's their that's like a usufruct. That's like a byproduct of what's produced.
So
basically, be careful, otherwise you're going to fruct up.
Yeah, Art, but I don't want to have to edit.
Arthur, stop it now. Arthur.
I didn't say the word. I just said for the fracture.
So
it was fractious. What you said was fractious, Arthur.
Yeah, fractious.
So
Damon. Okay,
so
carry
Kevin,
on.
what I'm saying is, say you've got a son that owns a building, and in the one apartment he said his father must stay there rent free, and that's got to be signed in the contract, but they can buy the building and rent out the other flats in the building. But his father is entitled to stay there rent free. And even in secular law, I think they'd have to honor that if that's the condition of the sale.
If it's in writing.
Yeah, sure. Sure.
So, can I just tell you a joke?
Sure.
This is clean, Arthur. I hope you don't mind. Arthur, I know you get offended. You're very sensitive, and you. So there was a chap we knew that worked for the deeds office, I don't know if he still does. So whenever someone saw him, whenever the guy made a comment that made a lot of sense, he used to say, indeed, indeed,
Shit,
because he worked for the deed office.
shit.
Arthur, is that above board, that joke, or is it crude?